beautiful wedding night turned into a nightmare. What began as a celebration of love and unity in a quiet, upscale neighborhood erupted into chaos when a racist neighbor called the police, spinning lies of suspicious activity. Within minutes, flashing lights and armed officers stormed the event, their actions DDD. Children were searched, elderly guests were humiliated, and the bride and groom, the heart of the evening, were treated like criminals. But what the officers didn't know was that this wasn't just any couple. The bride, a powerful judge, and the groom, a senior FBI agent, weren't about to let this injustice go unchallenged. What happens when those sworn to uphold the law face off against those who know it best? Will justice prevail, or will abuse of power overshadow love's most important day? Before we dive into this explosive tale of prejudice, power, and justice, drop a comment below, letting us know where you're watching from today. If you're as captivated by this story as we are, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a moment of inspiration and drama. The setting sun cast a warm golden hue over the well-manicured lawns of an elegant suburban neighborhood. At the heart of this idyllic scene stood a large, stately home, its backyard transformed into a magical venue for a celebration. Strands of twinkling fairy lights hung overhead, their gentle glow illuminating the happy faces of guests who mingled beneath. A light breeze carried the fragrant scent of roses and lilies from beautifully arranged centerpieces, enhancing the enchanting atmosphere. It was a perfect evening for a wedding. Smiles, laughter, and clinking glasses filled the air, mirroring the joy radiating from the newlyweds at the center of it all. Sophia, a renowned judge celebrated for her fairness and tenacity, looked breathtaking in her flowing white gown. Her dark hair was adorned with delicate pearls, and her warm smile reflected the golden light of the setting sun. Beside her stood Ethan, her devoted husband, a tall and composed man whose demeanor spoke of both strength and kindness. Ethan was a respected senior agent with the FBI, a protector by profession and by nature. As he rested a comforting hand on Sophia's shoulder, the love between them was unmistakable. Every glance, every quiet exchange of words spoke volumes about the bond they shared. Their wedding wasn't just a celebration of their love, but also a testament to the life they had built together. A life filled with dedication, shared values, and mutual respect. Choosing to host the event in their backyard had been a deliberate decision. To them, this home symbolized their partnership and their dreams, making it the perfect place to mark the beginning of their married life. Sophia's parents beamed with pride as they mingled among the guests, sharing stories of her childhood and her journey to becoming a judge. Her mother, a retired teacher, was the epitome of warmth, while her father, a former community leader, captivated listeners with anecdotes about Sophia's early years of ambition and grit. Ethan's family, who had traveled from across the country, added to the lively atmosphere. His cousins laughed heartily as they toasted the couple's future, while his younger siblings marveled at the elegance of the evening. Children ran through the garden, their laughter blending with the soft notes of live music playing in the background. The sound of glasses clinking echoed as guests raised toasts to love, unity, and the hopeful journey ahead. Unbeknownst to anyone at the celebration, a storm was brewing just a few houses away. In the quiet confines of her living room, Mrs. Gladys sat stiffly on her floral-patterned couch, peering out through the lace curtains. A longtime resident of the neighborhood, she was known for her sharp tongue and judgmental demeanor. To many, her perpetual frown and nosy habits were a source of amusement, but to those who had felt the sting of her prejudice, she was a thorn in their side. This evening, Mrs. Gladys's discontent was directed at the gathering in Sophia and Ethan's backyard. Her keen eyes narrowed as she observed the crowd of diverse guests enjoying themselves. In her mind, such a gathering was out of place in their upscale neighborhood. It didn't matter that the couple had lived there for years or that the celebration was perfectly lawful. To her, their presence, and that of their guests, was an affront to her narrow perception of who belonged. With a deep scowl etched into her face, Mrs. Gladys reached for her phone. Her bony fingers moved swiftly as she dialed the number she knew by heart. When the call connected, her voice sharpened into a tone of urgency and authority. "I'm calling to report a disturbance," she began, her words deliberately laced with indignation. "There's a very loud and suspicious gathering happening a few houses down. I can't imagine what they're up to, but it's causing a disruption to our peace." She paused, allowing her dramatic pause to sink in before adding, "It's not just the noise. It's the kind of people they've invited. I wouldn't be surprised if illegal activities were involved." The dispatcher on the other end took the report, her tone professional but skeptical. It was, after all, a quiet evening, and the claim seemed more inflammatory than credible. Nevertheless, the call was forwarded, and a few officers were dispatched to the scene. The prospect of investigating a potential disturbance in such a well-off neighborhood was an unusual break in an otherwise uneventful shift, and the officers approached the situation with curiosity and, unknowingly, with bias. Back at the house, the celebration continued in blissful ignorance of the impending storm. Sophia stood by the dessert table, laughing with a childhood friend as they reminisced about their school days. Nearby, Ethan engaged in a lively conversation with his uncle, who was planning an upcoming family reunion. In the center of the garden, guests had gathered to watch as the couple shared their first dance. The soft strains of a classic love song filled the air as Sophia and Ethan moved gracefully, their steps perfectly in sync. Their happiness was infectious, drawing cheers and applause from their friends and family. The twilight sky, painted in hues of pink and purple, created the perfect backdrop for this magical moment. The twinkling lights overhead seemed to amplify the love and joy radiating from the couple, making the evening feel like something out of a dream. Yet, beyond the hedges that bordered their property, shadows began to grow. The low rumble of engines broke the serene melody of the night. Headlights pierced through the dusk, and the sharp red and blue flashes of police lights illuminated the darkness. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, adjusting their belts and scanning the scene before them. Their expressions were neutral, but their body language carried an unspoken air of authority. As they prepared to approach, they exchanged a few brief words, their voices low but determined. Inside the yard, a young guest was the first to notice the lights reflecting off the house's windows. "What's that?" she murmured, catching the attention of those nearby. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd as more guests turned to see the row of police cars parked outside. The joyous atmosphere wavered, replaced by a growing sense of confusion. "What's going on?" Sophia asked, her brow furrowed as she followed Ethan toward the source of the disturbance. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of concern that mirrored the tightening knot in Ethan's chest. "Stay calm," Ethan whispered, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. Yet, as they stepped closer to the approaching officers, a troubling realization began to dawn on them. This wasn't just a routine check. The tension in the air thickened as the rumble of police vehicles grew louder, signaling the arrival of unexpected guests. Inside the backyard, laughter had quieted, replaced by murmurs of confusion as guests tried to understand what was happening. Meanwhile, just a few houses down, Mrs. Gladys sat smugly in her living room. She hadn't moved from her vantage point by the window, the lace curtain pulled just enough to allow her an unobstructed view of the chaos she had instigated. She sipped her lukewarm tea with a sense of satisfaction, convinced that her call to the authorities was the right thing to do. The truth was far from her carefully crafted story. She had told the dispatcher that the gathering was unruly, threatening, and possibly involved illegal activity. In reality, it was a joyous occasion, filled with nothing more dangerous than sparkling cider and heartfelt toasts. But to Gladys, the mere presence of a diverse crowd in her neighborhood was justification enough for her actions. The police cars finally came to a halt just outside Sophia and Ethan's home. 4 officers stepped out, their faces a mix of determination and suspicion. The lead officer, Sergeant Cooper, was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose piercing gaze surveyed the scene like a hawk. To him, any gathering in a neighborhood like this that resulted in a noise complaint was immediately suspect. As they approached the property, the sound of muffled laughter and music became clearer. To any reasonable observer, it was a celebration, hardly a threat. But Sergeant Cooper's mindset had already been colored by the report he received. "Keep it professional, but stay alert," he instructed his team, We don't know what we're walking into." The officers fanned out, walking toward the backyard entrance with a calculated pace. Sergeant Cooper knocked sharply on the wooden gate, the sound cutting through the murmur of the gathering. Inside, Ethan was the first to notice. He placed a calming hand on Sophia's arm before making his way toward the gate. His years of experience in law enforcement had taught him to recognize the telltale signs of authority approaching with a purpose. Sophia followed closely behind, her judge's instinct kicking in. She knew this had to be a misunderstanding, but the sudden arrival of police at their wedding unnerved her. As they reached the gate, Ethan opened it slowly, revealing the officers standing on the other side. "Good evening, officers," Ethan said evenly, his tone respectful but guarded. "Can I help you with something?" Sergeant Cooper stepped forward, his stance assertive. "We received a report of a disturbance at this address," he said. His voice was professional but carried an undertone of skepticism. "Mind if we come in and take a look?" Sophia and Ethan exchanged a quick glance. There was no reason for concern. This was a private celebration that was perfectly within their rights. Still, they knew better than to escalate the situation. "This is our wedding," Sophia said, her tone calm but firm. "There must be some kind of mistake. We've been celebrating here with our family and friends all evening, and we're well within the noise ordinance limits." Sergeant Cooper's eyes scanned the backyard, taking in the elegantly dressed guests, the twinkling lights, and the buffet table laden with food. To an outsider, it looked like any other upscale gathering, but his demeanor didn't soften. "We're going to need to investigate," he said curtly. There were reports of suspicious activity. "Suspicious?" Ethan repeated, his brow furrowing. "What exactly was reported?" Sergeant Cooper avoided the question, turning to motion for his fellow officers to enter the property. "We'll determine that as we conduct our investigation." The officers began moving into the yard, their presence cutting through the festive atmosphere like a cold wind. Guests looked on with a mixture of confusion and unease as the officers started weaving through the crowd, asking questions and scanning the area. Sophia and Ethan followed closely behind Sergeant Cooper, their initial confusion giving way to concern. The tone of the officers' questioning was not casual or polite. It was sharp, probing, and laced with a thinly veiled bias that neither Sophia nor Ethan could ignore. At one table, a young woman tried to explain that she was a friend of the couple and had been invited to the wedding. "This is a private event," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's nothing illegal happening here." The officer questioning her gave a curt nod but didn't seem satisfied. "We'll see about that," he muttered before moving on. Nearby, Ethan noticed one of the officers pausing to pat down a teenage guest, a boy no older than 15, who had been playing with a group of younger children. The boy's wide eyes filled with fear as the officer ran his hands over his pockets with unnecessary roughness. Ethan stepped forward immediately, his protective instincts kicking in. "Excuse me, officer," he said, his voice steady but firm. "That's a child. What exactly are you looking for?" The officer straightened, narrowing his eyes at Ethan. "Stand back," he ordered. "We're just doing our job." "Your job doesn't involve intimidating children," Ethan replied, his tone hardening. "Sir, step aside," the officer barked, his hand hovering near the baton on his belt. Sophia quickly moved to stand beside Ethan, placing a calming hand on his arm. She knew the importance of de-escalating the situation, even as her own frustrations simmered beneath the surface. "Officer," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I'm Judge Sophia Harris. I understand you're responding to a call, but I can assure you there's nothing unlawful happening here. This is a private wedding celebration, and we have all the necessary permits." Sergeant Cooper turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Judge or not," he said, "we still need to confirm the situation. Stay out of our way, and let us do our job." As the minutes passed, the unease among the guests grew. What had started as a beautiful evening now felt tense and invasive. Parents clutched their children closer, and elderly relatives whispered among themselves, wondering why this was happening. Ethan's brother, Jason, a lawyer by profession, stepped in to try and mediate. "Officers," he began, holding up his hands in a placating gesture, "I'm an attorney, and I can provide any documentation you might need to verify the legality of this event." One of the officers brushed him off without a glance. "We'll ask for what we need when we need it," he said dismissively. The blatant disregard for their explanations and rights was infuriating, but Sophia and Ethan knew better than to let their anger take over. Still, it was becoming increasingly clear that this was no ordinary noise complaint. The officers' actions, their dismissive tones, and the targeted questioning all pointed to something more insidious. Sophia's mind raced as she watched the officers move through the crowd. This wasn't just about a call, it was about prejudice, plain and simple. The very presence of their diverse group of guests had triggered an unwarranted response, and now they were being treated as suspects in their own home. Ethan leaned in close to her, his voice low and tense. "This isn't just a misunderstanding," he said. "They're looking for something to pin on us." Sophia nodded grimly. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "They're not going to find what they're looking for, but we have to stay calm. We can't give them an excuse to escalate this." Little did they know, the officers didn't need an excuse. The storm had only just begun. The joyous atmosphere of the wedding had all but evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension as the officers continued to question the guests. Conversations that once rang with laughter now fell to hushed whispers, and many of the guests cast uneasy glances toward the growing police presence. Ethan stood near the center of the yard, his sharp eyes following every movement of the officers. His instincts, honed from years in the FBI, told him the situation was spiraling out of control. Beside him, Sophia exuded a composed authority, though the tight set of her jaw betrayed her growing frustration. An elderly guest, Mrs. Ruth, stood near one of the buffet tables, nervously clutching her handbag as a young officer approached her. "Ma'am, can I see your ID?" the officer asked abruptly, his tone devoid of politeness. "My ID?" Mrs. Ruth stammered, clearly confused. "Why would you need that? I'm here for a wedding." "It's just routine," the officer replied, though his voice carried an edge that suggested otherwise. From across the yard, Sophia caught the exchange. She made her way over swiftly, addressing the officer with a calm but firm voice. "Excuse me, officer, but this is a private event. Mrs. Ruth is a guest at our wedding, not a suspect in a crime. Unless you have a specific reason for this request, I'd suggest you stop harassing our guests." The officer hesitated, glancing toward Sergeant Cooper for guidance. Cooper, who was overseeing the entire scene from the edge of the yard, simply nodded. The younger officer took a step back but didn't apologize. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Ruth whispered to Sophia, her hand trembling as she patted her shoulder. Sophia offered her a reassuring smile, though inside, her anger simmered. At the far side of the yard, Ethan's younger cousin Daniel, a 14-year-old boy with a shy demeanor, was the latest target of police scrutiny. Daniel had been standing near the dessert table, nervously shifting from foot to foot as an officer towered over him. "Empty your pockets," the officer demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Daniel looked around helplessly, his eyes landing on Ethan, who immediately sprang into action. "Enough," Ethan said as he approached, his voice steady but firm. "He's just a kid. You have no reason to search him." The officer straightened, meeting Ethan's gaze with a challenging glare. "We're conducting an investigation," he said, his hand hovering near the radio on his belt. "If you interfere, we'll have to take action." Ethan didn't flinch. Years of dealing with high-pressure situations had trained him well, but seeing his family treated like this was testing his limits. "This isn't an investigation," he replied, his voice low and controlled. "This is harassment. And as a federal agent, I can assure you that this will not end well for you if you continue." The officer's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but before he could respond, Sergeant Cooper stepped in. "What seems to be the problem here?" Cooper asked, his tone neutral but edged with authority. Ethan turned to face him, his expression calm but unwavering. "The problem," Ethan said, "is that your officers are treating innocent people like criminals at a private event. You're targeting children, elderly guests, and everyone in between. All of this without a shred of evidence to justify your actions." Cooper crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "We've received a credible report of suspicious activity," he replied. "Until we can confirm that everything here is above board, we'll proceed as necessary." Sophia joined Ethan, standing shoulder to shoulder with him as she addressed Cooper directly. "Credible report? she repeated. From whom? And what exactly was reported? Cooper didn't answer right away, and his hesitation spoke volumes. Sophia seized the moment. As a judge, I'm well aware of the requirements for conducting an investigation, she said. What you're doing here, searching our guests, treating them like suspects, is a violation of their rights. If you don't have probable cause, you're overstepping your authority. Cooper's eyes narrowed. Ma'am, I'd advise you to let us do our jobs, he said, or you may find yourself in trouble as well. Ethan took a small step forward, his presence radiating quiet strength. That's enough, he said. We're cooperating, but you've gone too far. We have nothing to hide, but we won't stand for this kind of treatment. The tension between the couple and Cooper was electric, drawing the attention of guests and officers alike. For a brief moment, it seemed like the situation might de-escalate. But then, another officer's voice cut through the night. Sergeant, we found something. All eyes turned toward the sound. At the edge of the yard, one of the officers held up a small bag of what appeared to be marijuana. It had been retrieved from the grass near the fence line, far from the main gathering. Sophia and Ethan exchanged a look of disbelief. They knew it wasn't theirs, nor was it likely from any of their guests. It was a plant placed conveniently, a setup if there ever was one. Looks like your gathering isn't so innocent after all, Cooper said, his tone dripping with condescension. Sophia stepped forward, her voice sharp. That's not ours, and you know it. This is clearly an attempt to justify your actions here tonight. I won't stand for it. Cooper smirked, his confidence bolstered by the supposed evidence. That'll be for the courts to decide, he said. For now, we're going to need to separate everyone for questioning. The guests erupted in protest. You can't do this, shouted one of Ethan's cousins. This is a setup, yelled another guest. Cooper raised his hand, silencing the crowd. If you cooperate, this will go smoothly, he said. If not, we'll have to start making arrests. Sophia's blood boiled at the blatant abuse of power. She turned to Ethan, whose clenched jaw mirrored her outrage. This is escalating, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. We need to stay calm, but we can't let this continue. As the officers began dividing the guests into smaller groups, Sophia and Ethan stood resolute, determined to protect their loved ones. They knew the officers were trying to intimidate them, but they refused to back down. The night that had begun as a celebration of love was unraveling into a nightmare. The once bright strings of lights now felt harsh, casting long shadows across the yard. The cheerful music had faded into silence, replaced by the low hum of tension and fear. But even in the face of such blatant injustice, Sophia and Ethan stood firm. They were not just fighting for themselves, but for everyone gathered there. Family, friends, and children who deserved better than this. Little did the officers know, the couple's resolve was unshakable, and the battle they had begun would have consequences far beyond this backyard. The guests, once jubilant and carefree, now stood divided into smaller groups across the backyard. The air was heavy with unease, and the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars cast an eerie glow on the faces of the bewildered crowd. Parents held their children close, whispering reassurances they didn't fully believe. Elderly guests stood stoically, some clutching their walking canes, their eyes wide with disbelief at the unfolding events. Sophia and Ethan stood at the center of it all, their presence a source of both comfort and strength for the guests. Sophia's white wedding dress, once a symbol of joy, now seemed almost out of place against the stark contrast of the night's chaos. Ethan's suit was slightly rumpled from his earlier attempt to intervene, but his posture remained steady and unyielding. Nearby, an officer barked a command to a group of teenage guests, demanding that they empty their pockets. The boys complied hesitantly, their hands trembling as they turned out their wallets and phones. One of the boys, barely 16, looked up at the officer with teary eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice cracking. The officer didn't respond, continuing his inspection with cold detachment. Sophia saw this from across the yard, and her composure cracked just slightly. She turned to Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. "This has gone far enough." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "We need to act, but carefully. One wrong move and they'll escalate this even further." Sergeant Cooper, who had taken up a commanding position near the garden gate, observed the scene with an air of control. To him, the protests and resistance from the guests were just noise, background distractions to be ignored. Ethan decided it was time to confront him. He made his way toward Cooper, his steps deliberate and his expression unreadable. Sophia followed close behind, her every movement measured. "Sergeant," Ethan began, his voice calm but firm, "your officers are out of line. This isn't an investigation anymore. It's harassment. I demand to know why this is happening." Cooper didn't flinch. "You demand?" he said, a mocking edge to his tone. "Last I checked, I'm the one running this operation. If you have an issue, you can take it up with the precinct after we're done here." Sophia stepped forward, her tone sharp and authoritative. "I'm Judge Sophia Harris, and you are overstepping your authority. Your officers are violating the rights of every person here. If you can't produce a warrant or articulate probable cause, then you're operating outside the law." Cooper's expression hardened, and for a brief moment, uncertainty flashed across his face. But it was quickly replaced by a sneer. "Judge or not," he said coldly, "you don't dictate how we do our jobs. We're here responding to a complaint, and until we're satisfied, nobody is going anywhere." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Satisfied?" he repeated. "You're using baseless accusations to justify terrorizing innocent people at a private event. If you think this is going to end without consequences, you're gravely mistaken." As the confrontation escalated, more guests began to voice their outrage. "This is a wedding, not a crime scene," one man shouted, his hands raised in frustration. Another woman stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "You're treating us like criminals for no reason." "We've done nothing wrong." The officers ignored the protests, their focus unwavering as they continued their questioning and searches. A few began asking for identification, jotting down names as if assembling a database of potential offenders. At one point, a young mother tried to step away to comfort her crying toddler, only to be ordered to stay where she was. "Ma'am, return to your group," an officer barked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "But my daughter," "Now," the officer interrupted, his hand inching toward his belt. The mother froze, her eyes wide with fear, before reluctantly stepping back into line. Ethan's brother Jason, a seasoned attorney, decided it was time to step in again. He approached Cooper directly, his voice measured but forceful. "Sergeant Cooper," Jason said, "I am an attorney, and I've been observing your officers violate the civil rights of every person here. This is a private event, and you have no legal grounds for this level of scrutiny. I strongly suggest you halt this operation before it escalates further." Cooper glanced at Jason, his expression indifferent. "Step back," he said curtly. Jason didn't budge. "You're making a mistake. Everything happening here is being recorded, and I can promise you that these actions will be used against you in court." The mention of recordings caused a ripple of tension to pass through the officers. Several guests had indeed been discreetly filming the events on their phones, capturing every act of intimidation and overreach. One guest had even begun live streaming the incident, ensuring that the unfolding injustice was already making its way to the broader public. Sophia saw an opportunity and turned to address the crowd. "Keep recording," she said loudly, her voice steady despite the storm around her. "Make sure there's a record of everything happening here tonight." Cooper's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer to Sophia, his voice low and threatening. "If you continue to interfere, Judge, I'll have you arrested." Sophia met his gaze without flinching. "You'd better be ready to explain to the courts why you're detaining a federal judge at her own wedding," she replied, her tone icy. For a moment, the tension was palpable. The officers seemed to hesitate, their earlier confidence wavering in the face of mounting resistance and the realization that their actions were being documented. But then, as if to reassert control, one officer roughly grabbed the arm of a teenage boy who had tried to step away from the group. The boy cried out in surprise, and the sound cut through the crowd like a knife. Ethan had seen enough. He stepped forward, his voice raised. "Let him go." The officer holding the boy turned to Ethan, his grip tightening. "Step back, or you're next." Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment it looked as though he might act. But Sophia placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "Not yet," she whispered. "We'll handle this, but we have to be smart about it." Ethan exhaled sharply, his anger barely contained. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but steady. The night continued to unravel as more officers began arriving on the scene. What had started as a small response to a noise complaint now resembled a full-scale operation. The backyard, once filled with laughter and love, was now a battlefield of wills, a confrontation between those abusing their power and those determined to stand their ground. Sophia and Ethan knew they were at a breaking point. The officers were emboldened, but so were the guests. Both sides were poised for a confrontation that would define the rest of the night and its aftermath. The tension in the backyard had reached its boiling point. The once celebratory gathering had devolved into a scene of confrontation, with guests clinging to one another for comfort, while the officers grew more aggressive in their demands. The air was thick with fear, confusion, and defiance. At the edge of the yard, Sergeant Cooper continued to bark orders, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the guests. "Keep everyone separated. We're not leaving until we've cleared this up." Sophia stood next to Ethan, her hand gripping his arm as she watched another officer begin searching through the bags and belongings of their guests without consent. She had spent years upholding the law in courtrooms, but witnessing such blatant disregard for justice in her own backyard filled her with a mix of fury and disbelief. "This has gone far enough," Sophia muttered under her breath, her voice laced with determination. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "They're not stopping. We need to take control of the situation before someone gets hurt." Nearby, an elderly guest, Mr. Henry, was being questioned by a younger officer who towered over him. Mr. Henry's trembling hands clutched the cane he used for support as the officer leaned closer, his tone impatient. "Where are you from, sir? Do you live in this neighborhood?" the officer asked sharply. I'm a guest at the wedding," Mr. Henry stammered, his voice barely audible. Sophia's blood boiled as she witnessed the officer's condescending demeanor. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her voice steady and authoritative. "That's enough," she said firmly. The officer straightened, his gaze hardening as he turned to face her. "Ma'am, I suggest you step back. And I suggest you stop harassing an elderly man who has done nothing wrong," Sophia shot back. "You're targeting innocent people without cause, and I won't stand for it." The officer looked toward Sergeant Cooper for guidance, but before he could respond, Ethan stepped in. His calm but commanding tone cut through the tension. "This man is a family friend and a guest at our wedding. Your actions are not only unnecessary but unlawful." Sergeant Cooper approached, his expression unreadable. "You're interfering again," he said coldly. "If you keep this up, we'll have no choice but to take you into custody." Sophia met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with defiance. "And if you do, you'll be arresting a federal judge and violating constitutional rights in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras. Are you sure that's the move you want to make, Sergeant?" The murmurs among the guests grew louder, their collective frustration and fear giving way to anger. Many of them had begun openly recording the confrontation on their phones, ensuring that every word and action was documented. The officer's growing unease was evident, but Cooper was unwilling to back down. Instead, he doubled down on his authority. "Everyone here is under investigation," he declared. "If you don't cooperate, we'll be forced to take more aggressive measures." His words were met with a chorus of protests from the guests. "This is harassment," shouted one woman. "You have no right to do this," another man added, his voice trembling with anger. The officers ignored the outcry, continuing to question and search the guests. One officer even began approaching the house, his intent to enter clear. Ethan saw this and immediately stepped forward, blocking the officer's path. "You're not entering our home," he said firmly. The officer stopped, his hand hovering near his holster. "Step aside," he ordered. "You don't have a warrant," Ethan replied, his tone unyielding. "If you try to enter, you'll be breaking the law." The officer hesitated, glancing back at Cooper, who nodded for him to proceed. Sophia quickly joined Ethan, standing shoulder to shoulder with him. "If you take one more step toward that house, you'll be held personally accountable for violating the Fourth Amendment," she said, her voice ringing with authority. The officer paused, clearly conflicted. The weight of Sophia's words, coupled with the fact that dozens of guests were recording the incident, seemed to give him pause. He stepped back reluctantly, but the tension remained thick in the air. As the confrontation continued, the crowd's fear began to transform into something more powerful: unity. Guests who had initially been too shocked or frightened to speak up were now standing shoulder to shoulder, their voices growing louder as they demanded answers. "We're not criminals," shouted one man. "Stop treating us like we're guilty of something," added another. The collective defiance of the guests seemed to rattle the officers, who began exchanging uneasy glances. Even some of the younger officers, who had followed Cooper's orders without question, now appeared unsure of their actions. But the turning point came when one officer, clearly agitated by the rising tension, moved toward an elderly woman who had been pleading with him to release her grandson. Without warning, he raised his baton in a threatening motion, causing the crowd to gasp. Before the baton could come down, Ethan surged forward, catching the officer's wrist in a firm grip. His voice was low and controlled but filled with unmistakable authority. "That's enough," he said. The officer froze, clearly taken aback by Ethan's boldness. But the moment of hesitation was brief. Another officer rushed forward, shoving Ethan back and sending him stumbling. Sophia cried out, rushing to Ethan's side as he regained his footing. "You're out of control," she shouted, her voice echoing across the yard. The lead officer glared at her, his patience clearly wearing thin. "That's it," he snapped. "You're under arrest." Two officers moved toward Sophia, their hands reaching for her arms. But before they could restrain her, the crowd erupted in protest. "Leave her alone," shouted one guest. "This is madness," cried another. The officers hesitated, clearly overwhelmed by the growing resistance. But Cooper's barked command cut through the noise. "Take them in, all of them if you have to." Sophia and Ethan found themselves at the center of the chaos, surrounded by officers who were determined to assert their authority. But even as the situation spiraled further out of control, they refused to back down. Sophia's voice rang out, calm but commanding. "What you're doing here tonight will not go unanswered," she said, her words cutting through the noise. "You're violating every principle of justice, and the world will know." Ethan stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. "We've spent our lives upholding the law," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "And we won't let you trample on it tonight." The officers, though emboldened by Cooper's orders, were visibly shaken by the couple's unwavering defiance. The crowd's support only added to their discomfort, and for the first time that night, the balance of power seemed to shift. But the battle was far from over. As more officers arrived and the chaos intensified, it became clear that the night would only get darker before justice could be served. The chaos in the backyard had reached a fever pitch. Guests shouted in protest, children cried in fear, and elderly relatives clung to one another for comfort. Officers, their authority already on shaky ground, now seemed determined to double down on their actions, unwilling to acknowledge the growing backlash. Sophia and Ethan stood together at the center of it all, their presence a beacon of strength for the increasingly defiant crowd. They had been pushed to their limits, but they knew this wasn't the time to falter. As two officers approached Sophia, handcuffs at the ready, she raised her voice with an authority owned from years on the bench. "I am Judge Sophia Harris," she declared, her words cutting through the clamor like a knife. "And this is my husband, Ethan Harris, a senior agent with the FBI. You are overstepping your bounds, and if you continue this unlawful behavior, I promise there will be consequences." The officers stopped mid-step, the weight of her statement sending a ripple of shock through the crowd and the law enforcement personnel alike. Sergeant Cooper, standing near the gate, froze for a moment before striding toward her, his face darkening with irritation. "A judge and an FBI agent?" he said with a mocking sneer. "And you expect that to mean something here?" Sophia's gaze didn't waver. "It means you're not just violating the rights of two private citizens," she said sharply. "You're actively undermining the law you swore to uphold, and it will not go unnoticed." Ethan stepped forward, his calm but commanding presence impossible to ignore. "We've stayed patient," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We've tried to reason with you, but your actions tonight will have consequences far beyond this backyard. Every officer here will be held accountable for what you've done." Cooper's smug expression faltered as he glanced at the other officers. Some shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. One of the younger officers, clearly shaken, lowered his baton slightly and looked away, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The guests, emboldened by Sophia and Ethan's declarations, began to speak out even more forcefully. "She's a judge," one man shouted. "You can't treat her like this. And her husband's FBI," another woman added. "Do you realize who you're dealing with?" A murmur spread through the crowd, and even among the officers, the tension shifted. The realization of who Sophia and Ethan were, combined with the fact that dozens of guests were recording every moment, seemed to finally cut through the shield of authority that Cooper had been hiding behind. But instead of backing down, Cooper took a step closer to Sophia, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You may be a judge," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "And your husband may be FBI. But out here, none of that matters. We're in control, not you." Sophia held her ground, her expression unflinching. "We'll see about that," she replied coolly. "Your actions tonight will be reviewed, and trust me, there will be justice." As if on cue, one of the guests near the back of the crowd raised her phone high in the air, her voice ringing out with clarity. "We're live streaming this," she announced. "The whole world is watching." The officers hesitated, the weight of those words hitting them like a tidal wave. In an instant, the balance of power began to shift. Ethan took the opportunity to address the officers directly. "If you value your careers," he said, his tone steady and measured, "you'll step back now. Release everyone and leave. Otherwise, I guarantee you'll be facing lawsuits, disciplinary action, and possible criminal charges." The lead officer from earlier, a graying veteran named Officer Hill, finally stepped forward. His face was lined with worry, and his voice carried a note of regret. "Sergeant," he said quietly, turning to Cooper, "we need to de-escalate this. We're in over our heads." Cooper rounded on him, his expression furious. "De-escalate? They've been resisting us this whole time." Hill shook his head. "No, they haven't," he said firmly. "They've been asserting their rights, and we've been ignoring them. We need to stop before this gets worse." The exchange between Hill and Cooper didn't go unnoticed by the guests, many of whom began to cheer and shout their agreement. "Listen to him," someone yelled. "He's the only one with any sense," added another. Cooper's face flushed with anger, but the cracks in his authority were becoming impossible to ignore. The other officers were visibly hesitant now, some lowering their weapons, others stepping back from the guests they had been interrogating. Sophia stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "You've already crossed the line," she said, addressing Cooper directly. "The only question now is how much further you're willing to go, and how much worse the consequences will be." Cooper glared at her, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed as though he might dig in his heels and escalate the situation further. But then, the weight of the moment seemed to catch up with him. With a sharp motion, he raised his hand, signaling the officers to stand down. "Everyone fall back," he barked, his tone filled with reluctant defeat. The officers began to retreat, stepping away from the guests and releasing those they had detained. Handcuffs were removed, and tension started to ebb, though the anger and fear lingered in the air. Sophia and Ethan stood together, their resolve unbroken. They had endured hours of harassment and abuse, but they had refused to yield. Now, as the officers backed away, they knew their battle was far from over. As the last of the officers regrouped near their vehicles, Officer Hill approached Sophia and Ethan. His expression was one of quiet remorse. "I'm sorry for what happened tonight," he said softly. "It shouldn't have gone this far." Sophia met his gaze, her expression firm but not unkind. "No, it shouldn't have," she replied. "But an apology isn't enough. There will be an investigation, and justice will be served." Hill nodded solemnly, then turned and walked away, leaving Cooper to face the couple one final time. "You may think you've won," Cooper said, his voice low and bitter. "But this isn't over." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "You're right," she said. "It isn't over, and when it is, you'll regret every decision you made tonight." With that, Cooper turned and strode toward the police vehicles, his authority shattered. The guests gathered around Sophia and Ethan, their relief palpable but tempered by the trauma of the night. Some were still shaken, while others expressed their gratitude to the couple for standing up to the officers. "We wouldn't have made it through this without you," one guest said, tears streaming down her face. Sophia placed a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder. "We'll make sure this never happens again," she promised. Ethan nodded, his arm around Sophia's shoulders. "This isn't just about tonight," he said. "It's about holding people accountable and making sure no one else has to go through this." As the police vehicles finally pulled away, the crowd began to disperse, but the sense of unity remained. The battle for justice had begun, and Sophia and Ethan were ready to see it through to the end. The blaring sirens and flashing red and blue lights were gone, but their impact lingered like an unwelcome shadow. The backyard, which had been filled with laughter and celebration only hours earlier, now bore the weight of what had just transpired. Tables were overturned, chairs scattered, and the once glowing string lights seemed to flicker with a somber hue. Sophia and Ethan stood near the center of the yard, surrounded by their guests. Though the officers had left, the tension hadn't fully dissipated. People whispered in small groups, their voices hushed and tinged with disbelief. Some were consoling children, while others comforted the elderly, many of whom were still shaken. Sophia looked around at the faces of their friends and family, faces filled with gratitude, fear, and quiet resilience. She knew they were safe now, but the memory of what had happened would linger long after this night. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, drawing her out of her thoughts. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," Sophia replied, though her tone betrayed her exhaustion. "But this isn't over, Ethan. They may be gone, but what they did here tonight will have consequences," Ethan finished, nodding. "I know, we'll make sure of it." As the couple moved through the crowd, checking on their guests, they were met with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Sophia, Ethan," said Mrs. Ruth, the elderly woman Sophia had defended earlier. "Thank you for standing up for us. I've never been so terrified in my life." Sophia reached out to hold the woman's hand, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said. "No one should ever feel unsafe at a celebration like this. We'll make sure this never happens again." Nearby, Jason, Ethan's brother, was speaking with a group of younger guests, many of whom had been directly confronted by the officers. Jason, ever the lawyer, was already taking notes on their accounts. "We'll need detailed statements from everyone," he told them. "Everything you saw, heard, and experienced tonight is important. This isn't just about us. It's about holding them accountable for what they've done." One of the teenagers, Daniel, looked up at Jason with wide eyes. "Do you think they'll really get in trouble?" he asked hesitantly. Jason knelt down slightly, meeting the boy's gaze. "If we stand together and speak the truth, we'll make sure of it," he said firmly. The younger children, who had been crying earlier, were slowly calming down as the other guests gathered around them, creating a safe and comforting environment. Ethan noticed one of his cousins gently rocking a toddler to sleep, her soft voice soothing the child's tears. He crouched down next to her and smiled. "You're doing great," he said. "Thank you for helping out." She nodded, her eyes red from crying. "I just can't believe this happened," she said quietly. "At a wedding of all places." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe it either," he admitted. "But what matters now is making sure this never happens again. Not to us, not to anyone." Near the buffet table, Sophia's parents were standing together, their expressions a mixture of relief and indignation. Her father, always the calm voice of reason, was comforting her mother, who was visibly upset. "I thought we'd lost her, Daniel," her mother said, her voice trembling. "When they came for Sophia, I thought they were going to hurt her." "They didn't," her father replied gently, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "She stood tall, just like she always does, and now she'll make sure justice is served." Sophia approached them, wrapping her arms around her mother. "I'm okay, Mom," she said softly. "We're all okay now, but I promise you this isn't the end of it." Her father nodded, his expression resolute. "We know," he said. "We raised you to fight for what's right, and we're proud of you, Sophia." As the night wore on, the guests began to leave, offering hugs and words of support as they filed out of the backyard. Many promised to stay in touch and provide any testimony needed for the legal battle they all knew was coming. By the time the last of the guests had departed, the backyard was quiet again. Sophia and Ethan stood together in the stillness, the remnants of their wedding scattered around them like pieces of a shattered dream. Ethan exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not exactly the wedding we imagined, huh?" he said with a wry smile. Sophia let out a soft laugh, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Not even close," she admitted, "but we made it through, and now we fight." The next morning, the couple wasted no time. Sophia and Ethan began documenting everything that had happened the previous night. With Jason's help, they compiled statements from the guests, collected the videos and photos that had been taken, and drafted a detailed account of the police's actions. The footage was damning. Clips of officers intimidating guests, aggressively questioning children, and even attempting to enter the house without a warrant painted a clear picture of abuse of power. Ethan sent the videos to his contacts in the FBI, ensuring that the incident would be flagged for investigation at the federal level. Meanwhile, Sophia reached out to legal advocacy groups, many of whom were eager to support their case. Within hours, the story began to spread. Social media erupted with outrage as the videos went viral, drawing attention from news outlets across the country. By the end of the day, the incident was making headlines, sparking heated discussions about police accountability and racial bias. Sophia and Ethan sat together at their dining room table, their phones buzzing constantly with messages of support from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. "I didn't think it would blow up this quickly," Ethan said, scrolling through an article that detailed the events of the previous night. Sophia nodded, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "People are tired of this kind of injustice," she said. "They're tired of being treated like criminals for existing in spaces that others think they don't belong in." Ethan reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "And now, we have the chance to do something about it," he said. Sophia met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "We will," she said. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been silenced or ignored." As the day turned into evening, the couple prepared for what they knew would be a long and grueling fight. But they also knew they weren't alone. Their friends and family stood firmly behind them, and the growing public outcry was a testament to the power of collective action. This was no longer just about their wedding night. It was about justice, accountability, and the hope for a better future. And as they sat together, hand in hand, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun rose on a new day, but the events of the wedding night were far from over. By the morning, the videos and images of the police's actions had gone viral, flooding social media with waves of outrage. Clips showing officers patting down children, aggressively questioning elderly guests, and attempting to enter Sophia and Ethan's home without a warrant were shared thousands of times. The hashtags Wedding Injustice and #Justice for the Harrises trended nationwide. Sophia and Ethan sat at their dining room table, which was now covered in papers, laptops, and phones, buzzing with notifications. Jason, Ethan's brother and legal counsel, paced the room with a notebook in hand, jotting down points as they discussed their next steps. "We have everything we need to move forward," Jason said, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. Guest testimonies, video evidence, and the officer's blatant disregard for basic rights. This case isn't just strong, it's undeniable. Sophia nodded, her expression resolute. "This isn't just about what happened to us," she said. "It's about sending a message. No one should have to endure what our family and friends went through." Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Have we heard anything official from the precinct?" he asked. Jason shook his head. "Not yet, but I'd be surprised if they didn't try to spin this somehow." Bookmark back. First official response came that afternoon when the local police department issued a statement. The carefully worded message claimed that the officers had been responding to credible reports of a disturbance, and that their actions were carried out in the interest of maintaining public safety. Sophia read the statement aloud, her voice dripping with incredulity. Public safety? They treated a wedding like a crime scene. Jason smirked, though his eyes burned with frustration. Typical damage control. They're trying to justify what can't be justified. Ethan, however, remained calm. "They're not prepared for what's coming," he said. "This isn't going away. not with the amount of evidence we have. The court of public opinion is already turning against them. Sophia looked at her husband, his unwavering confidence grounding her. Then let's make sure the legal system does the same, she said. Over the next several days, Sophia and Ethan worked tirelessly with their legal team to prepare a formal complaint against the police department. The lawsuit outlined multiple violations, including unlawful detainment, use of excessive force, and racial profiling. Civil rights organizations quickly rallied behind them, offering resources and amplifying their story. The national attention brought pressure not just on the local police, but also on the city's leadership, with calls for accountability growing louder. Meanwhile, Ethan's connections within the FBI proved invaluable. He reached out to colleagues who ensured that the incident was flagged for federal review. Within days, an independent investigation into the department's practices was announced. The community also played a crucial role in supporting Sophia and Ethan. Neighbors who had initially been silent about the injustices they'd witnessed in the past now came forward, sharing their own stories of mistreatment by law enforcement. At a press conference held outside the courthouse, Sophia addressed the crowd, her voice steady but impassioned. "What happened at our wedding was not an isolated incident," she said, her gaze sweeping over the sea of cameras and reporters. "It was the result of a system that has allowed prejudice and abuse of power to thrive unchecked. But we will not be silenced. We will fight for accountability, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has been treated unjustly." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a testament to the hope Sophia and Ethan's fight had ignited. As the legal proceedings began, the courtroom became a battleground for truth and accountability. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting the terror they had felt that night. Mrs. Ruth, the elderly guest who had been questioned aggressively, testified with a trembling voice. "I thought I was going to be arrested for no reason," she said. "I've never felt so scared in my life, and all I could think was, why is this happening?" Daniel, the teenage guest who had been searched without cause, shared his experience as well. "I didn't know what I'd done wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "It felt like they were looking for an excuse to treat me like a criminal." The most damning evidence came in the form of the videos recorded by the guests. Played on a large screen in the courtroom, the footage left little room for doubt about the officer's misconduct. Sophia herself took the stand, her years as a judge giving her testimony an undeniable weight. She detailed the officer's violations with precision, her voice unwavering as she described the impact their actions had on her, Ethan, and their guests. "This was not law enforcement," she said. "This was an abuse of power, and it's time for that abuse to end." Ethan's testimony was equally compelling. Drawing on his experience as an FBI agent, he outlined the proper protocols that should have been followed and emphasized how far the officers had deviated from them. "Law enforcement exists to protect and serve," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What we experienced that night was neither. It was a display of prejudice and power, and it has no place in our society." The defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Their attempts to justify the officers' actions fell flat, and their narrative of credible suspicion crumbled under scrutiny. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to capture national attention. News outlets covered every development, and public figures spoke out in support of Sophia and Ethan. The incident had sparked a larger conversation about systemic issues within law enforcement, and the momentum for reform was growing. For Sophia and Ethan, the fight was exhausting but necessary. They knew they were not just seeking justice for themselves, but paving the way for broader change. Finally, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The officers involved were found guilty of multiple violations, including unlawful detainment and use of excessive force. The court ordered significant damages to be paid to Sophia, Ethan, and their guests. The lead officer, Sergeant Cooper, faced the harshest consequences. In addition to losing his job, he was charged with misconduct and could no longer serve in law enforcement. When the verdict was announced, Sophia and Ethan embraced, the weight of the battle finally lifting from their shoulders. The courtroom erupted in applause, a rare but powerful moment of collective relief and triumph. As they stepped outside the courthouse, Sophia and Ethan were greeted by a crowd of supporters. Reporters shouted questions, and cameras flashed, but the couple's focus remained on the message they wanted to share. Sophia raised her hand, calling for quiet. When the noise subsided, she spoke, her voice clear and resolute. "This victory is not just ours," she said. "It belongs to everyone who has ever faced injustice and been told to stay silent. It belongs to everyone who has ever been treated unfairly because of who they are. Today, we prove that no one is above the law, not even those who wear the badge." Ethan stepped forward, his arm around Sophia. "This is just the beginning," he added. "The fight for justice doesn't end here. It's a fight we'll continue for ourselves, for our family, and for our community." The crowd cheered, their voices a powerful reminder that Sophia and Ethan's story had become a beacon of hope. The courthouse steps were filled with supporters, cameras, and reporters, their cheers and questions blending into a cacophony that marked the end of a harrowing journey for Sophia and Ethan. Hand in hand, the couple descended the steps, their expressions a mixture of triumph and determination. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was the first step in a much larger fight. The verdict had sent shockwaves through the local police department, the community, and the nation at large. But for Sophia and Ethan, it also marked the beginning of their commitment to a cause far greater than themselves. The aftermath of the trial was immediate and far-reaching. The police department faced a wave of scrutiny as the court-mandated investigation uncovered a disturbing pattern of misconduct. Officers who had participated in similar acts of abuse in the past were exposed, and several resigned or were dismissed under pressure. The city council, bowing to public outcry, announced a series of reforms aimed at preventing such incidents in the future. These included mandatory bias training for officers, the establishment of an independent oversight committee, and the implementation of body cameras for all patrol units. While these measures were a step in the right direction, Sophia and Ethan knew they were just the beginning. The couple quickly became symbols of resilience and accountability in their community. They used their newfound platform to advocate for systemic change, speaking at town halls, schools, and civic events. Their message was clear. Justice must be accessible to all, not just those who have the means to fight for it. At one community gathering, Sophia addressed a crowd of local leaders, activists, and residents. "What happened to us was a blatant abuse of power," she said, her voice strong. "But it wasn't unique. There are countless others who have faced similar injustices, but didn't have the resources or support to fight back. That has to change." Ethan followed with his own call to action. "As someone who has served in law enforcement, I believe in the importance of accountability," he said. "We cannot allow prejudice or unchecked authority to erode the trust between communities and the people sworn to protect them." Their words resonated deeply, inspiring others to share their own stories and join the growing movement for reform. News outlets continued to cover the story, framing it as a pivotal moment in the broader struggle for police accountability. Interviews with Sophia and Ethan aired on major networks, and their speeches were shared widely on social media. One particularly powerful interview featured Sophia speaking about her dual role as a judge and a victim of injustice. "It's one thing to study the law and uphold it from the bench," she said. "It's another to experience firsthand how easily it can be twisted and ignored. That perspective has changed me, and it's fueled my determination to ensure no one else has to endure what we did." Their story sparked discussions in households across the country, shedding light on issues of racial bias, excessive force, and the importance of community oversight in law enforcement. Amid the whirlwind of advocacy and legal battles, Sophia and Ethan also took time to reflect and heal. The night of their wedding, though marred by chaos, had also solidified their bond in ways they hadn't anticipated. One evening, as they sat together on the same porch where they had exchanged their vows, Ethan reached for Sophia's hand. "I know this isn't the wedding night we dreamed of," he said softly, "but I'm proud of how we stood together, of how we fought." Sophia smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It wasn't what we planned," she agreed, "but maybe it was exactly what we were meant to face. Together." The couple began to rebuild the memories of that night in small, meaningful ways. They hosted a private gathering for close family and friends, celebrating the love and unity that had carried them through the storm. As months turned into years, Sophia and Ethan continued to champion justice in their respective fields. Sophia returned to the bench with a renewed sense of purpose, using her platform to address systemic inequalities within the legal system. Her rulings often reflected her commitment to fairness and the protection of civil rights. Ethan, meanwhile, worked within the FBI to push for internal reforms. His efforts focused on training programs that emphasized de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, aiming to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. Together, they founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of police misconduct. The organization provided legal aid, counseling services, and advocacy for those who lacked the resources to fight back against systemic injustice. The couple's work inspired others to take action. Activists, lawyers, and community leaders across the country cited Sophia and Ethan's case as a turning point in the fight for accountability. Their story was taught in law schools, discussed in civic forums, and celebrated as a testament to the power of perseverance. One day, a young law student approached Sophia after a lecture she had given at a university. "Your story inspired me to pursue law," the student said, her eyes shining with determination. "I want to fight for people the way you and your husband did." Sophia's heart swelled with pride. "Then you're already making a difference," she said warmly. Despite their many accomplishments, Sophia and Ethan remained humble. They knew the fight for justice was far from over and that each victory was just one step in a much longer journey. "We're not heroes," Ethan said during an interview. "We're just two people who refuse to stay silent, and we hope our story encourages others to do the same." Sophia nodded in agreement. "Justice isn't a destination," she added. "It's a continuous effort, and it's one we're committed to, no matter how long it takes." Years later, the backyard where their wedding had been interrupted became a place of reflection and renewal. The couple planted a garden there, its vibrant flowers a symbol of growth, resilience, and hope. Every anniversary, they invited family, friends, and members of the community to gather in that garden. It wasn't just a celebration of their marriage, but a reminder of the strength that had carried them through the darkest of nights. As they stood together, hand in hand, Sophia and Ethan looked out at the smiling faces around them. They knew their journey wasn't over, but they also knew they had built something lasting. Something that would inspire others to stand up, speak out, and fight for what was right. The battle for justice had begun in their backyard, but its impact would echo far beyond it, carried forward by the countless lives they had touched. The story of Sophia and Ethan is one that resonates deeply because it reflects both the fragility and the strength of justice. Their wedding night, meant to be a celebration of love and unity, became a battleground for dignity and rights. Yet, through their courage and resilience, they transformed a moment of injustice into a movement for change. This tale reminds us of the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. It highlights how even in the darkest times, unity, integrity, and determination can light the way toward accountability and reform. Sophia and Ethan's journey wasn't just about seeking justice for themselves. It was about advocating for a better system, one where fairness is not a privilege, but a guarantee for all. The lessons from their experience are clear. We must never be complacent in the presence of injustice. Each of us has a role to play, whether through our voices, our actions, or our support for those who lead the fight. Sophia and Ethan's courage is a testament to the strength we all possess when we stand together against wrongdoing. If you found this story meaningful, let us know. Comment 1 if you think it was a good story, and comment 2 if you think it was amazing. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Have you or someone you know faced challenges like this? Share your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Your voice matters, and together, we can create a community that champions justice, equality, and hope. Let us know what you think about this incredible journey in the comments below. We can't wait to hear from you.